Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone, to our Bacchus Uncorked program, Wine in Roman Life and Death. My name is Jens Dehner, and I'm acting Senior Curator of Antiquities at the Getty Villa. I want you to take a moment and look at the title of today's event. I'm kind of struck by it. I don't know who wrote the title, but I think it's genius. And what's genius is that dash. It's the most scary dash I've ever seen. That's the length of a life. Right? Not Roman life and death, Roman life dash and death. All right. Our program, or our programs, this is one part of a series, or one episode of a series, explore art, wine, and culture in the ancient world. And we are delighted to welcome you to this evening's program that merges learning and wine, this time in the Roman world. In other words, we're giving you a perfectly good and educational excuse to consume alcohol. Today, yes, yay for alcohol. Today, we will learn about ordinary, everyday Romans, not the emperors and elites who are often the focus, and the role wine plays in their lives, as well as the significance of wine drunk at funerals and portrayed on cemetery monuments. This program series is generously supported by the Getty Villa Council, our loyal circle of friends, for which we are very grateful. Now, question, how many of you are new to Bacchus Uncorked? Can you raise your hand? I see a majority, but I also see loyal returners. Wonderful. We are glad you're all here with us today, and we hope you enjoy tonight's program. Now, for our speakers. Jeremy Hartnett is professor and chair of classics at Wabash College, where he holds the La Follette Distinguished Professorship in the Humanities. A specialist in Roman archaeology and social history, Jeremy studies sites in Italy, including Pompeii, Herculaneum, Ostia, and Rome, with special interest in everyday life in Roman cities. Jeremy is the author of The Roman Street, Urban Life and Society in Pompeii, Herculaneum, and Rome, which won the James Henry Breasted Prize from the American Historical Association in 2018. His next book, The Remarkable Life, Death, and Afterlife of an Ordinary Roman, is due out in October. I was given permission to share one unexpected thing or two about our speakers. In Jeremy's case, so he's leading the Wabash College pep band and is known to have destroyed several drums in the, in conducting this particular business. And his kids love him for being a master with leftovers. So he too knows about culinary arts that, of course, today we want to foreground when it comes to particularly what's in the glass. Diego Meraviglia is president and director of education for NASA. You didn't see that coming. That's the North American Sommelier Association. In 2008, Meraviglia obtained the Gold Pin certification with the Italian Sommelier Association and the Worldwide Sommelier Association. He's a certified master taster and a certified specialist of wine, that's all caps, with the Society of Wine Educators in the United States. A native Italian, Meraviglia is passionate about archaeology and ancient European history with a focus on his native land's Celtic heritage. And before Diego, started his career in wines, he told me he was actually a professional metal musician. Did you two destroy drums, or you knew how to play them?
I didn't have enough money to destroy them.
Okay. Please welcome me in joining our guests, and I invite Jeremy to the podium.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jens, for the introduction. Thanks to the Getty for the invitation and the opportunity to speak here. My charge is to talk about wine in the Roman world. But I also want to start by saying, let me see if I can get the slides to work. I want to start by saying that I'm no expert in viniculture. I'm a social historian, and I can say a lot about when, why, and how Romans drank wine. And that's really going to be the thing I'm going to focus on tonight. As Jens mentioned, when we think about Romans and wine, images like this one from the Getty collection might come to our mind. This is a painting from the 1800s that obviously shows a very healthy Roman who's indulging. And we should be, of course, thinking about these people, but I want to move beyond the emperors and fancy folk and concentrate instead on how wine pervaded the lives of everybody else, how it was important to them. But don't take this from me. I'm going to have a wingman along on this trip, and it's going to be this guy, a fellow named Flavius Agricola. You're looking at his funerary monument, which is in the Indianapolis Museum of Art, and it shows him reclining, as he would have at a banquet. Down by his feet is a cutting where his cinerary urn would have held his ashes, and you can also see that wine was important to him. He's cradling a glass in his hand, and he's also trying to draw our attention to the fact that he's crowning his head because he's at a party. So he's showing himself for all time. This is the way he wants people to remember him in posterity, as someone who reclined and drank. If you missed it in the sculpture, then his inscription, his funerary epitaph, underscored this point. He introduces himself, "I'm the one you see reclining here." And the wine was never lacking. It was flowing all the time. Now, this guy wasn't poor. The life-size sculpture and its marble material shouts that if he's not in the, he's probably not in the top 1%, probably not in the top 5%, but he's in that upper echelon. Nevertheless, his name, Flavius Agricola, for reasons I'd be happy to discuss over a glass of something, reflects the fact that he was probably only a generation or two removed from enslavement. His father or his grandfather was probably an enslaved person. So, let's take stock. This is the way this guy wanted to be remembered. I also love wine, but I hope that someone would intervene before I made a decision like this one. This is weird, right? And so let's think about what's going on here, that Flavius would put so much emphasis on wine. I'm going to take you to 3 different spots where Romans consumed wine, and I'm going to bring in a few objects from the Getty collection to illustrate my points. Let me start by saying that wine, as I mentioned earlier, pervaded all elements of Roman life. Part of this was, of course, the pleasures of the grape, but some of it was a matter of health. In the pre-modern world, if you didn't have an aqueduct bringing water to your city, wine might be one of the safest things to drink. We know this from Renaissance Florence, and it also helped boost a diet and fill in caloric needs that were unsatisfied by pulses and grains and legumes, etc. So where did everybody consume their wine? Well, mostly, like most people, probably consume their wine at street-side establishments like the one you see on screen. What did it consist of? A street on the right-hand side that opened through a broad doorway to a counter, embedded in which were a number of terracotta vessels. Also embedded within which were a place where you could cook food, and we think that may have been on offer in those terracotta vessels, although that's a highly debated issue in Roman archaeology. There was a water boiler because oftentimes the Romans would take their wine with some water added, and you might want it hot or cold, and of course a small chimney to let out some of the steam. The person who would be serving would be obviously behind this letter L, and they wanted to have a masonry countertop because if anything got spilled, they didn't want it to disintegrate, something that was, of wood, for example. You can see that this one was ready for a party, right? There are a whole bunch of those amphorae behind the counter, and you can see one of those for terracotta inserts is a little smaller than the others. It's identical in volume to the terracotta vessels that are stacked in the corner. So what did people do? They probably got their wine, it was poured into some other vessel, like one of the anthropomorphic pitchers you see on the right, and then poured again into a small cup that they would enjoy right around. So there are a ton of these things in a Roman city like Pompeii. 160 in the excavated parts of Pompeii, and only 70% of the city or so is excavated. So let's presume that there were maybe 200 of these things for a population of a city of about 15,000. That's one for every 75 people, one eating and drinking establishment. I don't know about you, but that seems like an extremely high density to me. So what was pushing people out of their living units into these places to eat and drink? Well, probably if they wanted to cook anything at home, if they had a place they could call home, there would be heat, danger of fire, smoke, and also when there's no wine bottles, how are you supposed to keep your wine, right? You're going to go to a place like this in order to have it dispensed. Now, our closest comparison to eating and drinking establishments at this level is actually in the developing world, and I'm recognizing that here we're talking about food establishments rather than street-side food establishments rather than wine shops. But you get the sense that Pompeii and Roman cities were not terribly dissimilar from places in the developing world now. So that's what pushed people out. What drew them into a place like this? Some of these spots had back rooms, and they would have tables set up in them. And you can see here we have a number of paintings that help add to our understanding of what would lure people. The ancient world is fascinating to study, but it was probably pretty boring to live in, right? And so where would you go for excitement? Where would you go to get the news of the day? There's no mass media. You might go to some place and gamble. You would sit down with other people and have the opportunity, for example, to be served by someone else. Here, there's a small inscription above the figure on the right's head that says, "Another cup of Satinus wine." Keep that in mind, because I think Diego's going to mention it a little bit later on. Another one says, "Oh, give a drop of cold." If you didn't like it hot, because it wasn't the winter, you might take a little bit of cold in your wine instead. For someone who is, trying to scrape out a living, the opportunity to be served by someone else, especially a lady in a very short tunic, would have had some attraction. I also want you to put one other thing in your mind. Notice the shape of the vessels. They're tall and cylindrical. That's going to contrast with our guy, Flavius Agricola. Let me take you to one other bar with some paintings in the back of it. They're almost like a cartoon, and you can see there was writing above each of the different heads. And they give us a sense of some of the other attractions of what might go on here. This is working from left to right. I'm not willing with Myrtle. So there might be an opportunity for romance, or somebody might not be excited about romance. Here you've got two figures, another person serving them, again with the cylindrical cup and with a jug of wine in her hand. And one figure says, "Here." The other one, "No, it's mine." And she says, "Whoever wants it should take it. Oceanus, come and drink." Notice that Oceanus is written in a slightly different hand, and I think it's meant to be a little bit of a joke. Oceanus is sometimes the name of somebody who was a bouncer at the theater if you sat in the wrong seats. So it's more like, whoever wants it should take it. Come and get it, big boy. Something along those lines. Again with the gambling. I won. Not 3, it's 2. And notice the same figures are going to carry on in the 4th panel, and something's going to happen to them. This guy says, "You no-name, it was 3 for me, I was the winner." This guy says, "Look here," I'm not going to translate this word into English. "Look here, Philator, I was the winner." I mean, and then bars, even in the ancient world, have bouncers go outside and fight. Somebody says as they're pushing these guys out the door. This was some of the attraction and excitement of going to one of these places, not just being pushed out, but being pulled into one of these things. Now, let's contrast that with what Flavius Agricola is doing. He's not standing up, he's not sitting down, he's reclining, and he's dressed differently from those guys as well. He's partaking in a Roman banquet, which we usually call or which the Romans called a convivium. You don't have to be an etymological expert to recognize the con means together, and the viv part, it's living together. And so what should we fill in? Even though he's shown alone, even just seeing him, we know that this is shorthand for a whole bit of a social occasion. He would have been on one couch. It would have been one of three, probably in a dining room of a small or a large size, and it would have been able to look out onto a beautiful garden, just as we're going to in a little bit of time. And so he's showing that he's not in public, he's in a private spot, draped in luxury, etc. And he would have been, of course, surrounded by other people. Though he's shown as a solitary figure, his dress, or lack of dress, his elegant couch suggests that he, like the diners that you see here, would have been surrounded by, for example, enslaved people who would have given him a pedicure, brought him a cup of wine, helped him out if he had been overserved. Or the importance of showing enslaved people is visible in that scene farthest to the right. That figure in the back is an enslaved person who is almost like the furniture, like the very expensive tableware they've got and a really nice piece of furniture. Now, I should say that though we're imagining him surrounded by attendants, perhaps surrounded by beautiful women, such as in the center picture, these are all idealized images of banquets. And they don't show one of the important social roles of them, which was, these are the places where the people who could afford to live at home, not live at home, eat and drink at home, invited guests over. And this was an opportunity for them to talk politics, talk business, and to oil the interlocking gears of power, wealth, and authority in the Roman world. So he's really showing himself able to marshal a social occasion, participate in this elevated realm through his wine and through his crowning his head, and also through his furniture. Now, our image, our eye might be drawn first to his face or to his chiseled abs. But for the Romans, they would also be paying attention to what was in his hand, that cup. And to paraphrase Freud, a cup is never just a cup, right? There's a big difference between a red solo cup and a piece of fine reedal stemware, right? So what can we figure out about the occasion from what he's holding in his hand? Well, unfortunately, we can't really tell what material it was made of. We can see that it wasn't particularly decorated other than a small lunate bit at the handle. But we might be able to think about what materials could be. Could it be silver, glass, or ceramics? Unfortunately, the shape, as these three images show, doesn't give us any indication of what material was Flavius' cup was made out of. Bronze is another possibility. Here's one that looks quite a bit like his. All right, so if we can't tell what material it was, what can we tell about its place in the solo cup to reedal stemware hierarchy? A few years ago, there was an exhibition of a silver hoard that was found in France here at the Getty. And you can see that there are a number of pieces that look quite a bit like Flavius's cup. They notice that they're some of the less decorated pieces, and they probably suggest that Flavius's cup is a fairly utilitarian piece. It's not meant to be fancy. It's not at the sort of pinnacle of that hierarchy. Let's think a little bit about what its shape can tell us besides just the register. How are we supposed to understand him using this? If you see that he's got a flat handle and then a fairly deep cup, that's going to contrast with other pieces that are of the basic same shape. This one on the right has a round handle, so it's meant to be able to be turned, and it's shallower because this is one that you would use to pour one out for the gods or for one of your friends who had met his maker. And so Flavius's cup is meant to hold more wine and to be able to be dosed in smaller amounts. Now, I'm going to leave it largely to Diego to talk about the kinds of wine Flavius might have drunk, but I want to mention one that's particularly famous in the Roman mindset, and it's called Falernian. Here's a graffito from one of those bars, and you can see the barkeeper says, here a person can drink for a small coin, you can get something better if you pony up 2, and if you pay 4, you're drinking the high, good stuff in Falernian. Here's a poem that says largely the same thing. This is what a party might be like. Come, boy, the word is puer, which means boy or enslaved person. You who serve the old Falernian, the good vintage, fill up stronger cups for me. And postumia, tipsier than the tipsy grape. But water, get lost, away with you, destroyer of wine, and go to the people who are a little bit more, serious, who don't have fun. Here, the wine is pure. This was going to be a really great party. And Falernian was going to, because they're not mixing, there's no mixer, right? It's all straight wine. All right, so that might be what he drank. Now, what would he discuss at a place like this, at a convivium like this? In his inscription, he starts off, he says, right before he says, the wine was never lacking, I took care of my little soul. In addition to business, in addition to pleasure, these places, these convivia, were spots for philosophizing. Don't take it from me, you can look at even some of the titles of ancient works. Plutarch wrote a book called Table Talk, Quaestiones Conviviales. You can, again, you don't have to be an etymological expert. And the first question that he encounters in this convivial questions book is philosophy, a fitting topic for a conversation at a dinner party. The dinner party guests debate this very philosophically, and they answer in the affirmative. Another book is called the Deipnosophistae. It says, these are the dinner philosophers, and they have a conversation over the course of this. Now, I recognize that in connecting wine and philosophy, I am not making a big leap here, right? Many of us, when we've had the third glass of wine, start to express our love for one another and turn to deep thoughts. But I want to work in Flavius's own words here and add in another part to this connection. This is how he finishes his funerary epitaph. He says, friends who read this, I admonish you. It's almost going to be a caption for his sculpture. Mix the wine, drink deep, wreath your head with flowers, and do not refuse to make love with pretty girls. After death, earth and fire consume all else. So this is not a fulsome philosophical treatise. It is the sort of thing you would mutter after the nth glass of wine, but it is philosophical in nature. And I think the fascinating part is the way that it mixes death into this matrix. Now, of course, again, I'm not exactly saying something deep here. When we're confronted with our own mortality, we're of course going to be asking some of the big questions. But this same motif continues on and on. This is an ancient novel, a section of an ancient novel that is built around a convivium like the kind that Flavius is expecting us to think that he's partaking in. And what happens is the host has a slave bring in a silver skeleton whose joints are articulated and they can be moved about. And then this inspires him to break into poetic philosophy. He says, oh, woe for us poor mortals, how this little guy is absolutely nothing, exactly how we all will be once Orcus takes us away. So let us live while we can still do so well. And here, if you go up to the second floor gallery in the Roman section, you'll see a bronze version of the very sort of thing that this author is mentioning. Why, when the Romans were having their best time, were they also thinking about death? Take it from another few examples. Here's a mosaic from a tomb on the Via Appia outside of Rome. Notice it's posed in the exact same way and it shows a skeleton rather than a person, and he's pointing at the Delphic maxim, know thyself. Or here, this is from Antioch, and it was a mosaic from a dining room, and it shows, again, a skeleton cradling a cup of wine. Lord knows where it's going to go once he drinks it, and the greeting there is, be in good cheer. So, wine and philosophy go together, death and philosophy go together, but for the Romans, it was this third part that for us is really hard to understand, that connected wine and death. And the philosophical ways that they enjoyed themselves over a cup. All right, so I've taken you to two places that the Romans enjoyed wine, whether it's the bar, the street-side bar, or the convivium. And now I'm going to take you to a third part that might be a little bit more surprising, the cemetery. What we're looking at is a Roman tomb, and you can see it's abutted by other ones, and then it has two clunae, two masonry couches in front on which someone could recline, have a drink. There's even a little shelf for them to put their cup and enjoy themselves in a cemetery. Now, we know that as part of the Roman funerary practice, they had a series of banquets and sometimes drinking bouts even for the 9 days after someone passed. But the real big event was the Feast of the Parentalia. It's like the Roman version of the Dia de los Muertos, where everyone would go and pay their respects to their ancestors at their grave. And sometimes we read in inscriptions about elaborate requirements for what's supposed to happen after someone dies. One guy wanted to have basically a WWE wrestling match, but then with flowers around his tomb, he wanted a whole pound of oil, so a pint of oil, poured over his bones. And then some of these places had like a second story where you could dine on top of the tomb. And he wanted all the city magistrates, all the city officials, the mayor, the sub-mayor, the head of the Kiwanis, to dine at his tomb on that day. And what they're going to eat? The meat from a sacrifice for him. Another guy had a vineyard around his tomb, and he wanted the fruits of that vineyard to be fermented and then poured over his bones on his birthday and on the Parentalia. 15 pints, he specifies. So by my count, help me out, Diego, that's like 22 bottles. So this is no small amount of wine that he wants to pour. And it wasn't just the fancy people. Obviously, the first guy is at the sort of tippy top of Mount Everest in terms of Roman hierarchy. If we look at a tomb that's underneath a car park in the Vatican, you can see amphorae that were buried in the ground. They held the cremated remains of the deceased, if you couldn't afford a tomb, and they kept their neck above ground so that people could come and pour wine for the deceased, so it would continue to nourish them after death. How are we supposed to understand what's going on here? Well, we've got another funerary epitaph from North Africa for a woman. And it says, all right, we've spent stuff for the burial, and now we've got an altar for our mother. Oh, and now we're going to have stories about the terrific things she did while we break bread, we drink, and have essentially a picnic to heal the wounds that gnaw at our heart. And we're going to tell stories deep into the night about our mother and remember them. That's not a bad thing. Didn't strike early Christian authors that way, however. Augustine, in the 4th century, writes that there are a lot of people who worship tombs, and they drink to excess over the dead, and they have feasts that they make for corpses, and they bury themselves over the buried and give to their gluttony and drunkenness the name of religion. It's kind of a sourpuss, if you ask me. But these are supposed to be, imagine one of these cemeteries being full of all sorts of people, all paying their respects to their ancestors on the Parentalia. It would be like, all right, I'm from the Midwest, or I live in the Midwest now. It would be like a football tailgate, right? With everybody having their type, they're trying to outdo one another. All right, so let's think a little bit about this. If we imagine Flavius in one of these tombs, as we know he was, where he was buried, and we go to there on the Parentalia, we'd encounter something particularly interesting, because the way that the Romans read was out loud. And so there are epitaphs that say, basically, when you come along and you're reading my words, the deceased's words, you're making my voice come alive again. So what you're reading, I'm speaking. Your voice, to be sure, is mine. Or, because this writing entrusted to the stone preserves my voice, it'll live by your voice, whoever read this inscription. And so, let's imagine that we're there with Flavius Agricola. We hear him, as we read his inscription, speaking in the first person. And he's life-sized, right? So we're not going to mistake him for being alive, but there's certainly lots of invitations for us to think of him either still enjoying the things he did while alive, or almost still recreating those things for those of us who are there after he's died. All right, so we've thought about wine as sustenance, as social differentiator, as prompt for philosophy, and as a way to celebrate the dead, drown our sorrows sometimes for those who died. And so I hope, I don't expect there are going to be triclinia set up in the outer peristyle when we go out there, but I hope that you'll think a little bit differently about wine, and you'll think about the different role wine played in the Roman world. I'm going to ask you to be a little bit more thoughtful respondent to people like Flavius than some of our predecessors, especially those who first found him. So let me tell you as a coda how he was discovered. You might have noticed that I've used two different images of Flavius Agricola. One as it appears in the Indianapolis Museum of Art today, and one with a reconstruction of his full funerary assemblage. Why did we start with that and end up with this? Well, the story starts in 1626. It's the later stages of the Counter-Reformation, and the place is Rome. In fact, St. Peter's Basilica. They're going to start digging for that big bronze, they're going to start digging the foundations for that big bronze baldacchino, which is created by the famous architect and artist Bernini at the crossing of the nave and the transept in St. Peter's. So they're going to start digging. Imagine that thing doesn't exist yet, and they're going to crack through the floor of the early modern cathedral. They're going to go down through history, going first into the church that was built by Constantine, the first Christian emperor, below it. And then as they dig down further, they end up cracking into a Roman necropolis of the 2nd and 3rd century. Now, they wouldn't be totally surprised because, in fact, the whole church was built on the idea that the high altar was right above the tomb of St. Peter. And certainly by the early 2nd century CE, people were making pilgrimages to this spot to pay their respects and to be close to the key apostle. But when they dug down in the southeastern corner for that foundation, they didn't find Peter's tomb. They didn't find any of his apostolic successors. Instead, they found 10 feet away from Peter's tomb, the tomb of Flavius Agricola. And you can imagine how this goes over in 17th century Rome when they find this as this guy's last words. Crowning heads, wreathing them with flowers, having wine, crowning their head with flowers, not a big deal. But when you start to get into the sexy times, and also probably the most offensive part is for the papal authorities is probably the eschatological part, saying denial seems of an afterlife. And so his inscription was carved off after the site was put on lockdown, and then all we're left with then is a sculpture. We can thank intrepid 17th century antiquarians for sneaking down and by torchlight transcribing his inscription. That's the reason that we have it. The sculpture, you might ask, once those things were carved off of it, they had no trouble. The Pope gave it to his nephew. He put it in his garden in the Palazzo Barberini. And I can tell you over wine how this piece got all the way to Indianapolis. So I want to say, as Paul Harvey says, that's the rest of the story. And thanks for your attention. And Diego.
So thank you, everyone, for having me. Thanks to Getty. This is truly one of my favorite times every single year. I've been doing this for years, so it's years. Good to see some familiar faces. So, as you see, I also included the dash, right? The so-called scary dash. But I like to think that with wine, that scary dash becomes a lot more fun, right? And I love Jeremy's presentation when he talked about, the epitaphs and the tombs, because it's always been my dream, growing up in Catholic Italy, where, the tombs and the cemeteries are always like, with flowers and images of people suffering and crying all the time. I was like, you know what? When I die, I want people to not bring flowers on my tomb, but to have a bottle of wine on me and then bring the empty bottle, put it on my tomb and be like, here's to you. So that every single visitor that comes by can say, oh my God, yeah, that's the guy who had the drinking problem, right? But no problem at all. No problem at all. I love wine, and as we saw and we will see, wine was ubiquitous in the ancient Roman world and throughout, the history of Italy as a culture and as a country, even before the unification in 1861. We know that Italy has absorbed as a nation through Roman expansion, Roman culture, this philosophy of wine being ubiquitous. So to echo some of the themes that Jeremy was talking about in everyday life and death for the Romans, we know that in Roman times, right, wine was used for celebration, right, to relax the mind, for recreational purposes, thought-provoking, philosophizing, the whole concept of symposiums. We've talked about, it was a status symbol, so depending on how much money you had, how much money you paid, you would have, better wines, more exotic wines too. And as the Roman Empire expanded and wine was exported throughout different countries in the Mediterranean basin, and different varietals of grapes were encountered, those wines were then being shipped back to Rome, shipped back to the main cities of the Roman Empire, and those were the exotic wines. And I've long been studying and cooperating with wineries in northern Italy about the Gaulish influence of wine and how we find literally very prized archaeological remnants of amphora or containers of wine, vessels of wine coming from some specific exotic place in Sicily or in the Iberian Peninsula and what the modern-day Spain and so on and so forth. So we know that this was a very, very common thread as a status symbol. And it was used for everyday life as sustenance, as part of your nutrition. So it's part of everyday life. And yes, you could have been a richer individual, a more wealthy individual, a more important individual, drinking Falernum, for instance, which we will talk about a little bit further, or more common wines, mixing the wines with, seawater, honey, garum, spicing them, boiled water, so on and so forth. Not that I would advise anyone today to actually be diluting your wine. For a more modern day quote, we remember, who said that in beer there is strength, in wine there is wisdom, and in water there's bacteria. So obviously, as Jeremy mentioned, sometimes it was a necessity to drink wine, and it was good for you if all you could drink was indeed wine. And we have very famous, obviously, quotes from, the Roman era about wine, dum vinum intrat ectit sapientia, so when wine goes in, knowledge comes out. As forma speculum est vinum mentis, so bronze is the mirror of the body, wine is that of the mind. So we go back to this concept of philosophizing and using wine as a lubricant for the thoughts and a lubricant for philosophy. And in vino veritas, right? In wine there is truth. So now that we've established that wine was central to everyday life in the Roman times, let's also know that the Romans were responsible for a lot of the winemaking techniques of the wine, the grape growing techniques that have been carried down through the centuries. And also the service, because even the concept of the sommelier, which I am, which Christian and Anush are, was born, in Roman times as the haustores. So the haustores were the sommeliers of the ancient world, the people that were responsible to stock the wine, taste the wine, prepare it, serve it, and suggest its consumption. So it was an ancient version of what we do today. And this is to echo also something else that we saw from Jeremy's presentation about being in good cheer, enjoy your life. So it's kind of like what I decided to do. I mean, as I was introduced, I used to be a musician, and I enjoyed playing music. I also enjoyed drinking, so they told me, hey, do what you want to do, what you love for a living, and here I am. I went from music to wine. But the whole concept was, life is short, enjoy it, and I would not be able to fathom a life without good wine. And also not just wine itself as a product to consume, but also the social aspects that come around, wine, the gathering, the dinner table, the fun, the talking, and so on and so forth. And the discussing about the wine too. I like this wine, you like that wine. Where does this come from? How is it made? So some of the best discussions, that you can have about wine are, of course, in a wine tasting or a wine gathering situation. So what wines exactly? It's fascinating for us to think about what wines were the Romans drinking, right? We're talking thousands of years ago. How did the wine taste? It's been something that all of us industry professionals have been asking ourselves for centuries, and it's very hard to pinpoint exactly how wine tasted back in time, because we don't have, obviously, any remnant of wine from the Roman times that we can actually taste. But we can make some deductions, and we can make some educated guesses. So we know for a fact that in Roman times, wine was diluted, it was spiced, and it was sweetened. So only if it was a very, very special wine was it drank pure. So like Falernum, for instance. I mean, I'm sure that some people would have diluted, spiced that too, but it would have been probably considered a little bit of a blasphemy because those wines were so special. But common wines every day in the ancient Roman times were indeed diluted with garum, which was a special kind of like fish sauce, seawater, with honey, spices, and so on and so forth. So it would have been kind of like cooked, so to speak, to suit the personal flavors of the individual. But we do know from menus that we've had in archaeological sites, and I believe that, Jeremy, you did talk about this image right here, where if you pay 1 coin, you get common wine, 2 coins, a little better, and with 3 coins, you drink Falernum. So we know that already back then there was a concept of wines of a specific provenance. So wines that came from specific vineyards, specific sites that would have been considered special, important, or better, and hence more expensive. Very, very similar to the concept that we have today. And we also know from archaeological artifacts that we have a division of the colors of wines, going from white to slightly straw yellow, rosé, light red, dark red, and then the austerum, right? The big, dark, heavy, potent, dry wines that were the biggest wines that you could get. So there was already back then a notion of wine provenance, coming primarily from the grape varietals and the vineyards, and also quality and color and structure. So they was far more advanced than we could think. But the wine style in ancient Rome for sure was rustic. Let's not forget that it was not until the Gallic Wars and the discovery of wood as a vessel for containing wine after Julius Caesar's expansion up in Cisalpine and Transalpine Gaul that we started using barrels. Something that we're very familiar with today, because in wine today we're used to those flavors, used to the vanilla, the spices, and the softness that oak and wood brings, to the wine aging. But it would have been no such thing in the ancient Roman times. Wines would have been made and contained only in clay and amphora. So they would have most likely had some very oxidative notes. They would have been oxidized. The containers were not airtight like our modern day bottles. The winemaking process was not sterile like we have today. So most likely, the wines would have been quite funky. And this funky term I use on purpose because a lot of people in this day and age use that to define those wines that smell a little bit like barnyard or that have those kind of very weird, intense flavors and notes. Think about the natural wine movement, which I do not appreciate that term because it makes all other wines seem unnatural, right? But the natural wine movement is somewhat like going back. So progress is regress almost, right? And I know a very famous winemaker in Italy who said, my God, we've spent the last 60, 70 years trying to find out how to make wine clean, and now we're like going back to Roman times. We're going back to times when wine is oxidized and it's kind of wild fermented and it's funky and so on and so forth. So most likely, today, wines like orange wines, they're called orange wines, so these very unique skin macerated whites will recall those flavors of what wines would have been in Roman times. So we can find something that gets very close. So there would have been no differentiation in winemaking between whites and reds. So today we do make white wine in a certain way and red wine in another way. Back in those days, it wouldn't have been the case. It would have been made exactly in the same way. And it would have had, obviously, all these oxidative notes like nuts, honey, bruised fruits, cereals, and then all these kind of like barnyardy and funky, wild flavors that you get in some of the wines that are part of the natural wine movement. So what are the vineyards? Because the Romans had a very clear notion that the wine was made in the vineyard, not so much in the cellar. It's only in the last 100 years that we've really developed the science of winemaking through the discovery of yeast, through the discovery of microorganisms, of biochemistry, fermentation, and so on and so forth. They wouldn't have had that knowledge back in those days. So the whole man component of wine, the transforming the grape juice into wine, would have been left completely to, to chance, to fate. But they did know that there were specific sites and specific vineyards that truly communicated far more quality and prestige than others. And the Romans tended to concentrate, as you would expect, around the region of Lazio, where Rome is located, in the main volcanic areas of Sicily, Campania, and central to southern Italy. So they knew that these volcanic soils were important for the quality of wine, that they generated wines of flavor, of complexity, of structure. And indeed, the ancient Romans were the first people to really come up with the notion of single vineyard wine, something that today is widespread, prominent, and very, very highly considered in the wine world. When I moved to the United States 20 years ago, I remember Napa Valley did nothing of the sort. They didn't really have many single vineyards. Now you go to Napa Valley and it's all about that single vineyards, right? It's not about just that Merlot from Napa Valley. It's that Three Palms Vineyard Merlot that Duckhorn makes, right? From that specific site where the Merlot is better, or at least considered more special than other sites. And Falernum was one of them. We see right here that, in the list we have Falernum, located in northern Campania today, the border between Lazio and Campania, just north of Naples, that we still have that area where Falernum is still made. Made in a modern way, made in a sterile and clean way, but the vineyards are there, the grape varietals are there, and that's where the wines would have come from. And all those names are all names of ancient Roman wines that would have carried the name of the vineyard, of the place, and would have been considered of a higher level of quality. Jeremy's presentation was primarily focused around, the 1st and 2nd century, so we know that this was the Roman Empire in the year 117 AD, so we do see the whole Mediterranean basin, and the Romans would have gone out of Italy, they would have exported the grapes, planted vineyards, new wines would have developed with the changing climate, with the changing environment, new varietals would have been created, new crosses and hybrids, and so on and so forth. So wine started to truly grow and explode once the Roman Empire started growing. Indeed, I love French wine, and I've worked for French wineries for the past 20 years. But I'm sorry if there's any French in the room. French wine is an Italian export. So if it wasn't for the Romans, 2,000 years ago, there wouldn't have been any wine in France. So without further ado, I think nunca est bibendum, so now it's time to drink. Please enjoy. Thank you.